take your time in writing a script and say, well, we're going to talk about Flint's band, and then let's talk about some of how they compare with other bands, and how was it like to be a musician, and various things. I mean, if you pre-write this stuff out, there'd be a better continuity. We both won't be flubbing for something to say, you know, because the minute you see I'm running out of something, bingo, you step up to the next one. And furthermore, if you should show me your script, I can prepare myself. See, when you hit me, just like Glenn Miller, I mean, I'd have been prepared with that if I knew you were going to ask, you know. Because at my age, why, your memory isn't so good. You don't know about that yet. You got a ways to go.
Yeah, well, I understand.
Are you on now?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, I just have a hard time formulating my questions. I know what I want to ask. That's the only reason I stammer a little bit.
Yeah, but I mean at your leisure, in between these things. As a matter of fact, I could do it too, as well as you, and then we can compare notes. And maybe I've got an idea in there that you didn't have. I might have more ideas than you because I know my life. I know what there is in it. And we could get our list together before we start on this thing. And you could have it out of the frame.
Yeah.
And written cue card style. So that every once in a while you could read that and see what's the next thing and be ready with that the minute I start and eyeing and running out of, say, bring the next one up, see. And it'll avoid a lot of duplication too.
Well, I've been pretty pleased with the direction we've been going.
Well, I'm not unpleased. I think we've done quite well with this.
But I can understand. I mean, I'll try and get better notes to you so you'll have a better idea of what we're going to be talking about. Because I think that's more what it is, because I have plenty of questions.
Yeah. Well, if you could put them in a sort of continuity.
Yeah.
Because I think what we're doing in this extemporaneous thing is a lot of repetition. I find myself saying again what I said last week.
Well, yeah. Well, you have mentioned a few things that we've talked about before, but I think it's better because we've been talking about different things.
Yeah, that's true.
And you've been mentioning things that are related to it, but it actually is helpful for me because then it gives it context for me.
Yeah.
Because if you were just talking about these things without mentioning other related things, then I wouldn't have any context of when they happened.
Yeah.
Unless you mentioned when they happened.
Well,
which you don't usually.
I think the ball is in my court as well as yours. I think I should, in the interim between shoots like this, make a list of things to show you when we get ready to shoot. And you could add or subtract whatever you want of that list.
Yeah.
And then you've got something to work with.
Yeah. Well, and that's, yeah. And that's fine because, because you know better than I what was going on. I mean, like when we talked on the phone yesterday, I said, we're going to cover the band years.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to get into all that.
Yeah, I've got some pictures.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready to shoot those.
Okay.
I don't have as many as I'd like to have. I'm sorry I wasn't more of a photographic bug back in those days than I became later on, because there was a lot of interesting things to photograph back in those years, and I just didn't do it. Or else I photographed them and threw the negatives away or whatever. It's a disaster as far as pictures are concerned. But anyhow, judging from where we left off.
Well, since just to give viewers what happened, we just lost our battery mid our shooting and lost the last half hour of what we talked about.
That's true.
and what we talked about was the music of the era and how it developed and came into its own and the evolution. I think that's pretty much what we covered, was just the music.
Yeah, that's covered and lost because of the battery.
Right. And I don't think that we want to go into it right now, having it fresh on our minds, having just run over it.
Yeah.
So I think since what we just finished off on the tape, because of what we just saw, we were going to talk a little bit about Prohibition. And I would like to talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
Because
all right.
because that's the 20s and into the early 30s was when it was going on.
That's right. 1919 to 1933.
And this is the time that we're
Yeah.
coming to right now.
All right.
So I know I've heard stories through the family that there was family people that may have been a little bit involved in
Bootlegging?
the process of manufacturing alcohol or
Well,
alcoholic beverages.
A lot of people, there was no law against making your own homebrew. You couldn't sell it.
Oh.
You could buy the makings to make your own homebrew, and my granddad, Grandpa Franz, had made it. He made his own wine, and perfectly legal. You go to the store and buy the malt and the hops and everything else, make your own beer. And it is powerful too. And another thing I remember, at the bottom of every bottle was the sediment was yeast at the bottom. And of course, the stuff you buy that's siphoned off. You don't see that. But homebrew always had that little coating of yeast down at the bottom. You drank down to that, and then you didn't drink anymore. But well, 1919 they passed the Volstead Act, which meant liquor was verboten. They ruled against it, and it became a article of the Constitution, an amendment to the Constitution, 18th Amendment it was called. And so theoretically that should shut off all alcoholic beverages for the sale of alcoholic beverages throughout the country. But those fathers of democracy that made the rule didn't really know what they were doing, because alcohol has been a very favored beverage of the human species since the year one. And so a little silly law is not going to change it. They're still going to drink, and they did. Only now it became illegal, and it was called bootlegging. And what happened is that instead of regular bona fide breweries and distilleries making bona fide liquor, hard liquor and beer and things like that, this was all done by illegal breweries, and hidden and out in the boondocks and places where they couldn't be discovered. And the irony of it was, where before liquor was taxed and the government got a little benefit off the sale of these things, now there was no tax or anything else, and it was costing us bundles to keep the bootleggers from flourishing. But the bundles didn't help, because the bootleggers did flourish, and with the good auspices of most of the humanity too, because everybody liked the idea, not that they drink in quantities, but the idea that they could have a drink if they wanted one. It was the lack of freedom that people resented, as much as the fact that there wasn't as much available. But if you knew how to get to a bootlegger, and everybody did, you could buy it. And another thing bad about the illegal hooch was there was no control on the quality of the stuff. Some of that stuff was what we called rot gut. And actually it did. It was so bad, it would rot your gut. Or in some cases it would blind you.
Wow.
It was a serious situation. And but the government lost all control over it, and they were fighting it. And you've heard of Eliot Ness, haven't you?
Oh yeah.
Eliot Ness, he was on TV. His exploits were on TV for a great many years. And he was an honest to goodness federal narcotics man, or not narcotics, but alcoholic man, G-man. And his exploits were famous, and that's the reason they did this series on TV about him. But he was just one of thousands of G-men whose sole purpose in life was to find and break kegs of beer and close up illegal breweries and distilleries, and where they'd tear one up, two more flourish. And another thing too, not only were they dying in here, but we were a great market for Cuba and other places. They would bring the illicit booze to the America by boat, you know, and then distribute it. And it was a holy loving mess, I'll tell you that. And anyhow, that went on until 1933 in the Roosevelt administration, when they finally found out that it was a losing battle, and they what do they do when they kill an amendment?
Oh, they passed another one to repeal it, I think.
Yeah, well,
isn't that what it was?
well, whatever they did, they knocked the 18th Amendment of Volstead out of our Constitution. And everybody not everybody, a lot of those that were the dries that they called, those that wanted to keep prohibition, predicted that, boy, everybody would be drunk the minute they could out. But boy, the opposite took place. It seems that when it became legal again, people didn't want it as much. There was a certain thrill in knowing it was illegal and going to speakeasies, which were bars that were hidden away and allegedly out of the law's knowledge, but nothing was out of the law's knowledge. But the law just let them get by because they were paying off or something. It made crooks out of everyone. It made drunks out of a lot of people that wouldn't have been drunks too. But anyhow, the repeal, this is the word I'm getting, the repeal of the Volstead Act was a real blessing, and for a lot of people and for society in general.
Well, putting it on a personal level, how did it affect you and your family?
All right,
and
I'll
things
tell
like
you.
That?
Well, I don't know it affected the family too much. We were not a family of drinkers. We drank socially. My granddad, who brewed his own home brew, as I mentioned, probably had a bottle of beer a day, something like that, after he got home from work or something like that, or maybe two, and would share it with members of the family that were over there and everything else, and also the same way with his wine. Grandma Franzen never touched either one of it. Oh, that brings another aside, and that is, we would like to taste the beer, you know, as kids, and so we'd ask Grandpa whether we could have a taste. Well, Grandpa would give us a taste. he didn't say anything wrong, but Grandma did. So Grandma would make us root beer. And I remember Grandma's root beer as being the tastiest stuff that was ever. But she made that purely to keep us from having beer. She said, anytime you want beer, I'll give you root beer, you know. It was one of those things. And which we didn't mind. Beer would satisfy our curiosity, but the root beer would satisfy our taste.
Yeah.
It tasted much better than beer. And so that was a happy compromise. And then in high school, because it was illegal, and there was a certain thrill in trying to beat the odds, we would buy alcohol from bootleggers. And I remember one place in particular, Grandinetti's store. The Grandinetti, Mr. and Mrs. Grandinetti, which are elderly people from Italy, they had a store out in East Davenport, small store. But their main stock and trade was bootleg hooch. And we kids, 14, 15 years old, could go in there, and if we had the right amount of money, and ask you go to the back and just stand around and wait till she waited on you, she or he, whatever. And you get a half pint of hooch or something and give them the money for it and walk out. And that's a great thing for prohibition, to allow a situation like that to go on. And so anyhow, we thought that was great, and we'd go out Friday night probably partying or something like that and have this little bottle of stuff. And I'm thinking a few times I got drunk, and I think it's only been a few times, probably 3 or 4 times in my life that I got really plastered.
Yeah. Oh, when you were a teenager, or
well,
or you're just saying?
I mean, my entire life. I'll say it's half a dozen times my entire life. But anyhow, we always wanted to impress everybody, all of our buddies, that boy, we're really loaded. So we would put on a drunk act, you know, and slur our speech and do all the stuff that indicated we were drunk, and we weren't. You know, as soon as our parents came, we're sober as a judge. Oh shoot! But
so was that when you were? This was like younger teenage years,
well,
when
I'd
you
say
do
from
stuff like that?
15, from 15 on. Oh, and another thing, it was popular to have a bottle of hooch in your high school locker.
Oh.
Yeah, that you were one of the in. It was ridiculous. And there was such a thing as spiking. You could buy near beer. Near beer is what the word implies. It was nearly beer, and the reason it wasn't all beer is because the alcoholic contents was missing. So you had the taste and everything else, but no alcohol. No. But you could buy that, and then you would spike it. By spiking, you'd drink a little of the top off the bottle, enough to accommodate some real alcohol. And you'd put it in, and you'd turn it over and mix it. See how good I am at this?
You've done it a couple times.
Then you turn it back up, and then you drink it, so because that mixes it all up. And but like I say, I mean, I was a moderate for a kid. And in fact, I think we were all moderate drinkers. Like I say, we pretended we were drunk, much more than we ever were. And we never, as my gang, ever got in an automobile accident because of having drunk too much. So that says something for the fact that we weren't drinking an awful lot. And furthermore, it was often that you just got sick if you drank too much, and you threw up all over wherever. So that was discouraging, and that's one of the reasons I kept from drinking too much, I suppose, not because I was so moral, but because if I drank too much I got sick, and I didn't like that. But anyhow.
So that was it. So it sounds like it was fairly common for people to brew their own.
Oh yeah, it was. Yeah, yeah. And those families that liked to have a drink would brew their own, and it was perfectly legal, but you couldn't sell it. You couldn't distribute it or anything like that. There's laws against that. But for home consumption, there's nothing wrong with it. But a lot of people just didn't brew it at home. It was so easy to find a bootlegger, find a place to buy it. I mean,
it wasn't worth the trouble
to
make your own.
Within every square 3-block area, there was someplace you could buy it.
And it was easier than having to make your own.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, since we're on the subject of illicit things.
Well, you love illicit things, don't you?
Why not?
All right.
What about drugs? I mean, I know the forms of drugs have evolved to an extent now where there's lots of different kinds. I mean, back then there was opium and there was marijuana and things like that. And I know they weren't obviously not as widespread as now, but certainly they were around. Did that? And I know in the 1920s, especially, marijuana became pretty well known, if not widely used.
very well known. I don't remember, and being a kid, I would be hip to all this because mostly teenagers are on top of anything that's illegal. I seem to gravitate toward it. But I don't remember marijuana. The first time I remember marijuana was when I was in the band business. Or no, this was before I was in the band business. Or just starting out in the band business. And I went over to Rock Island, Illinois to hear a band that came in from out of town on a one-nighter to a ballroom over there. And I don't remember whether we saw them smoking on the stand or something, but anyhow, somebody told us that the band was high on marijuana. What's marijuana? Well, that was the first time I ever heard of it. And then they found out, well, they're smoking that stuff up there. You know, I don't know whether the ones that were informing me of this knew any more of what they were talking about or not. But anyhow, that was my introduction to marijuana. I never heard of that. But the heavier stuff, like particularly heroin. The earliest I remember of this was back in the 20s when they put out a movie. What was the name of it? I don't know whether I can remember. This is way back in Charlie Chaplin's time. This is back in the 20s and perhaps the early 20s. It was the early 20s. And it was a movie about a guy that became a dope fiend. And the trials and tribulations he went through. I remember they likened dope as being a wolf.
Yeah.
And they had this wolf ghost come into the picture at the beginning of the scene and disappear or come back again in the back at the end of the scene. It was a symbolism.
Right.
But anyhow, this movie told of the disastrous consequences of this dope and everything else. And how he went out of his mind and everything else, and how he couldn't do anything but think of dope, which was actually a fact about it. If you got high on that stuff, you're hooked.
Right.
It's true today. And they're lucky to ever get out of it. But that was my introduction to that. As far as dope being used, generally, no. I don't know and never did know anybody that was on dope. Not to say that there wasn't any, but it was very few and far between.
Right.
And in fact, it wasn't until the 60s that dope entered the scene, in my recollections. Honey, do you remember that?
What's that?
When was the first time you realized that that dope was a part of the scene?
In the 60s?
In the 60s, that's what I thought. Prior to that, the only things that we had going against us was alcohol and cigarettes. I think even in the 60s we knew that cigarettes weren't good for us. I think we found that out in the 50s. But as far as dope is concerned, and then in the 60s along come marijuana. To begin with, that's the first thing we heard of. Then we started hearing about cocaine. And then the resurgence of heroin,
Right.
which we've always thought was the worst of the worst. You know?
Right.
Cocaine's bad enough, but the heroin was the most addictive of all.
Right.
And I guess that's true yet today.
Well, getting back to that then, what were the attitudes about smoking tobacco, cigarettes, and things like that? I mean, I know
Well,
in the golden era of Hollywood, everyone smoked.
absolutely.
At least they
certainly
showed
did.
everybody
yeah.
smoking.
Well, and that got all the rest of us smoking too. That was one of the things that had all of our movie stars were sucking on cigarettes. And about my 15th year or something like that, I experimented around along with other kids. We'd usually get some cigarette butts. Somebody had left a long cigarette or something somewhere, and we'd start sucking on those, and boy, we'd cough and hack and everything else. But because it was the in thing, we stayed at it, persisted until we got over the hacking. Our lungs became accustomed to it, and so and then we were hooked. And I wasn't hooked that early, but I experimented that early. I don't know when I find
So, clear back in the 20s then, it was an in thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Was
Yeah.
that, but that was, I mean, that wasn't necessarily from Hollywood because there was silent pictures and things like that. I mean, was that why it was in, or was it in because
Well, it
just
had an
was?
awful lot
Because
to
the
do
adults did it, or
It's the same way today. I mean, in spite of what the Hollywood wants to tell you, what they put out in movies has a tremendous effect
right.
on our young people, if not the older ones as well. I mean, now, if you'll notice, there's, everybody is smoking again in the movies, and boy, I'll tell you, that has an influence. And we find out that our kids are smoking more, and perhaps that's the reason for it, or one of the reasons. No, movies weren't the only thing. It was a peer pressure type of thing. All our kids were doing it, and so we had to do it. You know, peer pressure is a tremendous amount of pressure all through life, but mostly teenage. You've got to do what the crowd is doing. But that's not to say it isn't true when you're older too, because you've heard of the thing keeping up with the Joneses. It's more a question of keeping up with everybody else,
Right.
not just the Joneses. And so that's peer pressure as exerted upon adults. Kids, we always hear of peer pressure where kids are concerned. I mean, their dress. I mean, one is if it's like saddle shoes. When your mother was a kid, saddle shoe was a white shoe with a black overlay across the center. They called it the saddle. And saddle shoes with it, and boy, you wouldn't come to school without saddle shoes, you know. And that's the same way today with these type of things.
Right, tennis shoes.
Yeah, you got to have not only tennis shoes, but you got to have the right brand
Right.
tennis shoes.
Right.
And the right brands cost you about $80. I buy mine for 15 because I don't care. So anyhow, we were talking about dope and
Smoking.
and smoking.
specifically.
So anyhow, well, and another thing too, as is discovered now, finally, the cigarette companies, the tobacco companies, kept the fact that it was a dangerous drug so secret that nobody ever had an idea that there was any way you're going to pay ultimately for smoking these things. And so why not? And they were so cheap. I mean, I think the first time I bought a pack of cigarettes, which is 20 cigarettes, it cost about 15 cents. Now it's approaching $5, $4 or $5, because of the horrendous taxes they're putting on it.
Didn't people have any kind of idea of what it might be? I mean, because if everyone just assumed it was okay or not that bad, I mean, I'm sure your mom wouldn't let you smoke.
No, your parents were very disappointed to know that you've been smoking and so forth. They rallied against it, but I don't know exactly why, except that it was an adult habit, and where kids weren't supposed to do it. Maybe there was some feeling that it wasn't good for you. Well, they certainly knew it wasn't good for you, but
Yeah,
they didn't
they didn't know how
necessarily
bad it
know
was.
how bad it was. But in spite of what parents thought, smoking was taken up by the majority of the people somewhere between 15 and 18 years of age. It's the kids that started. Anyone that was an adult that wasn't hooked didn't usually get started on it. They hooked the kids, and once you're hooked on that stuff, it's awful hard to quit. It's a dope. And fortunately for me, I finally quit. But I smoked most of my life.
When did you start?
Well, I can't say for sure. I'd say 17, 18, somewhere in there. Let's see, when I was in the band.
So it was when you got into the band?
Sometime about the time I got in the band.
In the Emo Flint band?
Well, even probably a little bit ahead of that. Because peer pressure, you know, high school and everything
Yeah.
else. So, I was not immune.
Right.
And I quit, after I'd been in the band for quite a while. In fact, it was after 1934 when we went to Chicago. No, before we went to Chicago, 1933 or somewhere in there. We all smoked in the band. And that wasn't unusual. Everybody smoked.
Right.
It's unbelievable. Particularly men. The women didn't start smoking that early. It was bad for women to smoke. But pretty soon it became chic for them to smoke, and they started smoking. And they soon caught up with men. But somewhere prior to going to Chicago, Roy Lear, our trumpet player, quit smoking. And which is quite a feat. And anyhow, he made such a big noise about it and was ridiculing the rest of us because we smoked, you know, and that